Kia ora tātou. It's a huge pleasure to be here, particularly because about a couple of years ago, when this place was beginning to grow out of the ground, Liz showed my wife, Lynn, and I around, and as we walked through this building, the kind of the basic structure was here, and we could only imagine what it was going to be like. So that was kind of like this place in winter, and arriving this afternoon to see how it's come to life. So this is kind of spring now for this building, and it's starting to be populated with all sorts of wonderful people and ideas. And it's a thrill to be here and see how well it's progressed in that short time. And I very much look forward to seeing what it's going to look like in fullness of summer, as all the great hopes you have for this place really come to fruition. And that's not just about this place, it's about reconnecting Northland as an organisation, which I followed very closely from its very beginnings, and very fascinated by its journey, that now has it very deeply rooted in the people here in Taitokoro, and of the people, and bringing that knowledge and those people together to really bring about a transformation, a regeneration of the people and the land up here. And I think it's a real exemplar for us. And just to set that going way out into the global perspective on this, a huge privilege for me in recent years has been to go to the United Nations annual climate negotiations each year, which is this extraordinary hui of humanity. Last year in Dubai there were 40,000 of us, and all the way through just the recent years, you see in the reports from the United Nations on climate a stronger and stronger body of evidence coming through from Indigenous people, from Indigenous knowledge, and that is becoming more and more important in our understanding of how we tackle these enormous challenges we have. So I'm going to talk about that very big picture, because with obviously lots of references to what we're doing here in Aotearoa, because I think at times we need that sense of not only connection in our own country, but that sense that there is a real worldwide desperate need for this, and some terrific things underway. And I am just going to hope, this is going to work with me standing here. I was sitting right at the back, and I could only see this much of the screen. So I'm not going to sort of really talk to I'm going to talk to the slides, but don't try and look at them even if you're in the front row. And I'll make sure that a PDF of this is, for example, on the Reconnecting Northland website, if I may. So there are all sorts of sources here that I hope would be useful to you, and you might want to look back. I always, thank you for giving a bit more room here. I always think a bit about titles, because they're really important. And it's a huge privilege for me in the work I do that I'm not a great doer like all of you. I'm not on the land, I'm not in a factory, I'm not teaching in a school. I have this enormous privilege of sort of wandering around, trying to pick up what's going on and try to offer some reflections on that, in the hopes that that's useful to people who would be interested in reading about this. So on one hand, I often feel very superficial, but on the other hand, I think it is really important to try to think about ways all these issues connect. And I think of myself as being a connector. So that led me to this title about As the World Turns. But what we've got to do as the world turns, we have to restore our relationship with living nature. We have to make sure that everything we do works with nature and not against it. And I truly believe that it's going to be possible for 10 billion people, because that's where we think population's heading by 2050, for 10 billion people to live in right relationship with the living earth again. And not that we've had 10 billion before, but at one time people were living in right relationship. And that seems completely impossible that we could provide for 10 billion people. But as you work through the issues, you can see how we have so degraded nature, we've so degraded the living earth. If we learn how to work with it and not against it, we will be able to meet our needs in a way that continues to help nature restore itself. This has now become, geologists tell us, although they're still arguing as to whether officially to call it, this is the era, the epoch in the history of the planet, which has a new name. It's the Anthropocene. So we, the anthropods, it's named after us. And it's named after us because we humans, are now the biggest single force of change on the planet. So what we've done is, in the way we've been behaving, we think it's taken us a long time, a couple of hundred years or so, to get to this point that we're doing this much damage to the planet. But we've been like a nuclear explosion in Earth time. This period of time, human time, has been so short, and our impact has been so huge, we're like a nuclear explosion. And what is deeply fascinating but worrying now is nature is changing, nature's systems, whether it be climate and the like, and now changing faster than we are. So we think nature's very slow moving, but actually nature's now moving far faster than we are. If you look at the Earth's surface, we humans actively manage 75% of that land around the world. And we manage it very, very badly. For example, here in New Zealand, we erode from our land and wash it down our streams, our rivers, 200 million tons of topsoil a year. Globally, that's a mere drop in the bucket. In terms of the land globally, which is now considered substantially degraded, that's now about at least 3/4. We're undermining the well-being of people because we're so drastically undermining the well-being of nature. And if we carry on the way we're doing, by 2050, 95% of that land would be degraded. Each of us can only do our infinitesimally small thing, but we can show the way. We are preparing that knowledge base. We're beginning to helping to get that momentum going. And so we can drastically increase the speed and the complexity of change that we're able to pull off as we take our cues from nature. I just want to reflect very briefly on how precious this biosphere is. This is a picture of Earth from the surface of the moon, and it's this gorgeous, gorgeous blue marble, as people first called it when we saw the first picture of the Earth from space. Turning this around, that's the moon up there, and the atmosphere is so astonishingly thin. You can find molecules about 500 kilometers up, but basically it's only about 10 kilometers of atmosphere where there is where almost all the air is. But last year we humans pumped 41 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, well up on the previous year, and the impact is huge. So since 1950 the human population in the world has trebled. I think we completely lose track of that in terms of how fast human population's grown, how fast our impact has been, an 8-fold increase in emissions since I was born. Here's another way of looking at it. Adam Neiman is a British scientist who is deeply fantastic on graphics, and this is one of his from a few years ago. If you take all the atmosphere in the world that thin layer that makes life possible on this planet, and bring it together in one place at sea level pressure. That would only be a balloon just about 2,000 kilometers across. You wouldn't even get to Australia, right? This is all the surface fresh water in the world. And if you bring it together in one place, it's this tiny droplet that's all the water, 1,400 kilometers across. That's oceans as well, because oceans are very thinly spread. But if you bring together all the surface fresh water in the world, and there's some big freshwater lakes, like in the US, it's only 62 kilometers across. And as I was driving up from Tamaki Makaurau yesterday afternoon, and it was 160 kilometers from Auckland to Tamaki Makaurau, I got halfway and went, "Oh, I've run out of water," metaphorically. And again, this preciousness of the planet is largely lost on us. Now, actually, the science of this is relatively new. It's called Earth System Science. It's the first time scientists were able to bring many disciplines together to help us understand what we were doing to the planet. And that was work that started in the 1970s and began to come to fruition in the 1980s. And that gave rise to the planetary boundaries. These are 9 physical, chemical constraints of the planet. And the biggest overshoot is in phosphorus and nitrogen flows, entirely created from the way we farm and fertilize land, and that's a global phenomenon. That's the biggest overshoot. The next biggest overshoot is the loss of biosphere integrity, i.e. biodiversity and the rest. And climate change is racing up there as well. So even just in these 3-year periods, 2009 to 15 to 13, we blew out from 3 boundaries to cross, 4 boundaries were crossed, and now we've crossed 6 of those 9. We do have our own planetary boundaries report. We are the only country that's ever asked the Stockholm Resilience Centre to do one for us. MFE was keen on the project but very nervous about it, so they slipped it out just before Christmas in 2020. It's hard to find on their website, but that's the link to it. It does tell us very clearly, in that global terms, what we're up to in New Zealand. There is this fantastic opportunity for us, because if we turn that around so we're working with nature and not against it, we can help nature restore itself and reverse these trends, but at the same time, rather selfishly, being able to sustain more of us. One of my great heroes, who's far more articulate than almost all journalists, is Secretary General Antonio Guterres of the United Nations. And this quote actually now goes back almost 3.5 years, and he said some wonderful things since. But to me, it's still the one that brings together so many of these issues. We are facing a devastating pandemic, and that was true at the time, but it still lingers on. New heights of global heating, new lows of ecological degradation, and new setbacks in our work towards global goals for more equitable, inclusive, and sustainable development. Equitable because economics as we've been practicing it, business as we've been practicing it, is fundamentally broken. I still call myself a business journalist, but I like to think I'm on the sort of leading edge of where I hope business and economics needs to go. Because the way most of us are practicing that now is completely broken. So anyway, the rest of the quote is, to put it simply, the state of the planet is broken. Dear friends, humanity is waging war on nature. This is suicidal. Now, I'm going to fast forward. That's about biodiversity. This is about farming. The global food system is about $10 trillion of revenue a year. But if you add back all the negative consequences which aren't costed into that, So that's health, obese people, under people with no inadequate nutrition, pollution, pesticides, and other health damaging factors. And then the ecological ones about emissions and natural capital lost and food loss, waste, and all the rest. The negative consequences of the global food system add up to $12 trillion worth. So fundamentally, if the global food system was pricing itself correctly, if it was using proper economics, it would have been bankrupt a long time ago. And we know it's bankrupt, in terms of the impact on the planet. And so this is, of all the functions of society in the world, this one of how we use land and how we farm, and how we do that in an equitable and in complete relationship with nature is at the heart of this. And if we look at biodiversity loss, just 4 value chains in the economy account for 50% of biodiversity loss. It's food and beverages, it's infrastructure of mobility, it's energy, and it's fashion. So in that sense, where we need to focus our efforts for all the complexity that's involved is still gives us a very clear steer on where we need to go, not the least of which on the food side. Just going back to COP very briefly, this past one in Dubai, it was COP 28. It has taken 28 annual meetings to get agriculture and nature properly on the agenda. And seriously, that's how long it took. But it was very exciting to see the Food and Agricultural Organization from the UN and many others coming together to start making a big impact. And whilst all this time there's been so much focus on fossil fuels, it's really important, and we've still got a long way to go on that, it's really important to remember that only 3 years ago did fossil fuels get themselves into or pushed into the final declaration for that COP. And now we are seeing some final momentum at last. So I think that we're beginning to see at a global level that same sort of final moment of momentum, initial momentum to get things running. The next big concept is that we humans have to back off nature in a really big way. Not just by still living on the land, but living well on the land, but understanding we actually have to give nature a lot of elbow space. And this is really possible because now far more than 50% of people live in cities, which have a very small footprint. So if we were to set aside 30% of oceans and 30% of land to truly regenerate, that's a big project. There is serious commitment by some countries around that. It would make a big difference. But so far, only 15% of land and 15% of fresh water and 8% of the oceans are protected in such a way. So it's not just a question about getting best practice, but it's making sure on the land and the water we use, but making sure we confine ourselves into areas that we can work well with nature, but making sure we give nature plenty of elbow room elsewhere. Very briefly now, by way of closing, I'm not going to offer you any kind of detailed program about how we do this. Because in essence, the only thing we need to do is to understand, to care, and to change our thinking and our practices very fundamentally. That's essentially all we've got to do. It's quite a complicated to-do list, but it's current Western thinking and practice that has got us to this point. It's linear, it's extractive, it's patriarchal, it's about individual rights and interests. We see these vested interests fighting back, and it's pitiful how little money can change the outcome in a constituency, as we saw on the West Coast in the last election with the mining lobby there. I think they spent about $30,000. But that's what's got us into this total mess. And we start from we've been working away at a Western approach to regeneration and circular economy thinking, whereby everything we borrow from nature, we manage to give back to nature in some way, and trying to regenerate the partnership between people and nature in some kind of new way of thinking about the commons. So there's some of that going on, and that's good. But for me, the greatest joy of coming to Aotearoa kind of unexpectedly for work, and I'm now officially 27 years old. I've aged badly, obviously, but Monday was the 27th anniversary of my first day in Aotearoa. Right from the very start, and I have to say it was in the Anglican Church, starting at St. Matthew in the city in Auckland, welcoming, for example, the 1998 hikoi into the city, and being helping to look after the hikoi in Auckland. It's what Te Ao Māori, tangata whenua tell us, and what Indigenous people around the world are telling us. So you have been hugely hit by the impacts of this square thinking about colonisation, westernisation, and urbanisation. And we're trying to put this right with rights such as treaty rights and legal rights and human rights. Those are good, we've got to do all those things. But how do we manage to bring all of these systems together? And that's why I love this place, and that's the place where I try to do my thinking now, whereby Mātauranga Māori, a sort of a spiral connected thinking, helps us through understanding those shared obligations and responsibilities. I have no idea where this chart came from. If anybody does know, please tell me. I have this little kete of wonderful charts I plan to use someday, and I found this last year, and where did that come from? And I have no idea where it's come from, and I don't know who to give credit for. So if that looks familiar, please tell me, because it's not mine, but it absolutely encapsulates the thinking. So we look at a gorgeous river like that here in Aotearoa, and it quite simply it looks green, and there's on the land, and there's that lovely water there, but we know that it's far more complicated about that. But we know how to living in right relationship with that is even more complicated. And I think we have some very unique responsibilities here in Aotearoa, because we were the last large landmass in the world to be settled by people, perhaps about 35 generations ago. But since then, particularly in the last 100 years or so, we've brought about one of the fastest descents from pristine to degraded ecosystems in the world. And because what we have here is so precious, I believe that we have this wonderful responsibility, but also fantastic opportunity to be true leaders in helping achieve one of the fastest and fullest regenerations of nature, and helped by that extensive indigenous knowledge and wisdom. And not just because I cycle down Aparana Avenue quite a lot in Glen Innes, I'm a great fan of Aparana Nata, and it's well over 100 years ago. He wrote about Mātauranga Māori and Mātauranga Pākehā, and he talked about the great benefit of casting our nets between them rather than fishing in one or the other. One example of that, we're just wrapping up our 10-year-long 11 science challenges, which a national-led government, Wayne Mapp was Minister of Research, Science and Technology, built into those 11 national science challenges a big obligation to engage with Mātauranga Māori. And I've really seen in the two that I've been closest to of those national science challenges, that having a big impact in the way Western science has been thinking about how to progress issues. So very simply, I'm just going to leave you with one last quote. In my own search on this, I'm asking you, what's my indigenous knowledge? I'm Anglo-Saxon. What did the Anglo-Saxons do before they went out and tried to colonize the world and kick off the Industrial Revolution and do all these other things? And I have hardly begun that journey, but I have one great guide in this. John Muir was a Scot, born in Scotland. In fact, my niece runs his birthplace museum and trust in Scotland. And so there's a little bit of whakapapa there in a sense. But in the States, growing up, he became one of the leaders, one of the founders of the original United States environmental movements. He took President Roosevelt camping to Yosemite and said, look, we have to create national parks to preserve this. Muir wrote 8 wonderful books. He called them his wilderness journeys. And in the 1890s, he came down here to New Zealand, and had some very astute observations about us here. But here's the quote. He says, every time we tug at something in nature, we find it connected with the rest of the universe. Thank you. And apologies for going on slightly more than my allotted time when you have a very tight schedule.
We'll let you on.